I'm Jessica Parker, and 3 days before what should have been the happiest day of my life, my own mother looked me straight in the eye and said the words that would shatter everything I thought I knew about family love. Honestly, Jess, this whole wedding is just embarrassing. We'd rather not be associated with this disaster. My father nodded in agreement while my golden child sister Amanda smirked from across the room. They didn't just skip my wedding. They made sure the entire town of Millbrook knew exactly why they wouldn't be there. But what they didn't expect was how their perfect daughter would respond when pushed too far. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up as the middle child in the Parker family meant I was always caught between expectations and reality. My parents, Patricia and Robert Parker, owned the most successful hardware store in Millbrook, Ohio, a business that had been the backbone of our small town for over 4 decades. Everyone knew the Parkers. We were the family that sponsored Little League teams, donated to church fundraisers, and never missed a community event. From the outside, we looked picture perfect. But inside our colonial house on Maple Street, I learned early that love came with conditions. My older sister Amanda was everything my parents wanted in a daughter. She was studying to become a doctor, had perfect grades, and was engaged to Tyler Mitchell, whose family owned the largest real estate company in 3 counties. Amanda never had to work for their approval, it flowed to her as naturally as breathing. Meanwhile, I was the one who helped at the hardware store every weekend since I was 14, who organized my parents' anniversary parties, who remembered every birthday and holiday, but somehow, nothing I did ever measured up to Amanda's effortless perfection. When I was 25, I started my own event planning business. It wasn't glamorous like Amanda's medical school path, but I was good at it, really good. I had a natural eye for design and could stretch a budget further than anyone thought possible. I planned weddings for young couples just starting out, anniversary parties for folks who'd been married 50 years, and graduation celebrations that made families cry happy tears. My business, Parker Events, grew through word of mouth in our tight-knit community, but when I'd share my successes at family dinners, my mother would just nod politely before launching into another story about Amanda's achievements at medical school. Everything changed when I met Marcus Williams at the Millbrook Harvest Festival 2 years ago. He was new to town, having moved from Columbus to take over his uncle's auto repair shop. Marcus was different from the guys I'd grown up with. He was thoughtful, funny, and he actually listened when I talked about my dreams of expanding my event planning business beyond Millbrook. More importantly, he saw me for who I was, not as Amanda's lesser sister or the hardware store girl. When he proposed last Christmas in front of the giant tree in Millbrook Town Square, I thought my life was finally falling into place. But my family's reaction to Marcus was lukewarm at best. They were polite to his face, but I caught the subtle comments. My mother would mention how Tyler, Amanda's fiancé, was from such a good family, while asking pointed questions about Marcus's background. My father would nod when Marcus talked about the auto shop, but never with the enthusiasm he showed when Tyler discussed his latest real estate deals. I told myself it didn't matter. Marcus and I were building our own life together, and we didn't need their approval to be happy. The problem started when I began planning our wedding. Marcus and I had saved $15,000 for the celebration, which would cover everything we wanted: the Millbrook Community Center, a local caterer, flowers from Henderson's garden shop, and a DJ who'd done 3 of my client weddings. It wasn't going to be the wedding of the century, but it would be ours. I was excited to plan my own special day after spending 2 years creating magical moments for other couples. But from the moment I shared our plans, my family found fault with every detail. The community center wasn't elegant enough. Why weren't we renting the ballroom at the Marriott in the next county? The local caterer was too casual. Couldn't we hire the company that had done Amanda's medical school graduation party? Even our decision to have a DJ instead of a live band became a source of criticism. People will talk, my mother warned, her voice heavy with disapproval. I tried to explain that Marcus and I wanted something authentic and within our budget. We weren't trying to impress anyone, we just wanted to celebrate our love with the people who mattered most. But every conversation about the wedding left me feeling deflated and defensive. Amanda would sit quietly during these discussions, occasionally offering suggestions that were 3 times our budget, always delivered with a sweet smile that made me feel foolish for not being able to afford what she considered basic necessities. The criticism intensified as the wedding date approached. My mother started making comments about how simple our plans were whenever she ran into friends at the grocery store or church. I'd hear through the small-town grapevine that she was telling people we were keeping things low-key in a tone that suggested this was somehow disappointing. My father, who had always been a man of few words, became even quieter whenever wedding topics came up, which I interpreted as his quiet disapproval. 3 months before the wedding, Amanda announced that she and Tyler were planning their own celebration for the following year. Within a week, my parents were bubbling with excitement about venues, caterers, and guest lists. The difference in their enthusiasm was stark and painful. Amanda's engagement party planning sessions at our dining room table were filled with laughter and animated discussions about floral arrangements and menu options. Meanwhile, my wedding updates were met with polite nods and suggestions that we reconsider our choices. I should have seen the warning signs, but I was too caught up in my own happiness to recognize how deep their disappointment ran. Marcus noticed it before I did. After a particularly tense family dinner where my parents spent an hour discussing Amanda's wedding plans, while barely acknowledging ours, he pulled me aside. "Jess, I need you to know that I don't care if your family approves of our wedding or not," he said gently. "What matters is that we're happy with our choices. But I'm worried about how this is affecting you." He was right to be concerned. I was losing sleep, second-guessing every decision we'd made, and constantly defending our choices to people who had already made up their minds. My event planning business was suffering because I was too distracted to give my clients the attention they deserved. Rachel Thompson, my best friend since high school, tried to be supportive, but even she started suggesting that maybe we could upgrade a few things to make the family happier. 2 weeks before the wedding, the situation reached a breaking point. I was at my parents' house, showing them the final timeline, and making sure they knew their roles in the ceremony. My father was supposed to walk me down the aisle, and my mother had agreed to do a reading. Amanda was my maid of honor, though her enthusiasm for the role had been minimal at best. As I spread the papers across their dining room table, trying to inject some excitement into my voice, I noticed their expressions growing increasingly uncomfortable. "Jessica, we need to talk," my mother said, her voice taking on the tone she'd used when I was in trouble as a child. My father shifted in his chair, suddenly very interested in his coffee mug. Amanda looked up from her phone with barely concealed interest, like she was about.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Out to watch an entertaining show. "What's wrong?" I asked, though part of me already knew this conversation wasn't going to end well. My mother took a deep breath, glancing at my father before continuing. "We've been thinking about the wedding, and honestly, we have some serious concerns. The venue, the catering, the whole presentation, it's just not what we expected for our daughter's wedding." I felt my stomach drop, but I tried to stay calm. "Mom, we've talked about this. The community center is beautiful, and Mrs. Henderson has been catering events in this town for 20 years. Everything is going to be lovely." "But that's just it, Jess," Amanda chimed in, her voice dripping with false concern. "It's not really lovely, is it? It's adequate. And Tyler was just saying how his friends might find it all a bit, well, beneath what they're used to." The words hit me like a slap. Beneath what they're used to. As if my wedding was something to be embarrassed about, something that needed to meet the approval of people I barely knew. My father finally spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. "We just think you might want to reconsider some of your choices. Maybe postpone things for a few months. Save up for something more appropriate." "Appropriate?" I repeated, feeling anger building in my chest. What exactly is inappropriate about celebrating love in our community, with local businesses, within our budget? My mother's expression hardened. Don't get defensive, Jessica. We're trying to help you avoid embarrassing yourself, and frankly, embarrassing us. People are already talking about how modest your plans are. We've built a reputation in this town, and this wedding reflects on all of us. That's when the truth came spilling out. This wasn't about my happiness or my marriage to Marcus. This was about their image, their standing in the community, their fear that my modest celebration would somehow diminish their social status. I sat there, staring at three people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, and realized they were more concerned about what the neighbors might think than about my happiness on the most important day of my life. Fine, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. If you're so embarrassed by my wedding, then don't come. Problem solved. The silence that followed was deafening. I'd expected them to backtrack, to assure me they didn't mean it that way, to choose their daughter over their pride. Instead, my mother straightened in her chair and delivered the words that would change everything between us forever. Honestly, Jess, this whole wedding is just embarrassing. We'd rather not be associated with this disaster. My father nodded slowly, as if he'd been waiting for someone else to say what he'd been thinking. Amanda didn't even try to hide her satisfaction, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, like she'd just won some contest. I didn't know we were playing. I gathered my papers with shaking hands, my vision blurring with tears I refused to let fall in front of them. Then stay home, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, all of you. As I walked toward the door, my mother called after me with one final twist of the knife. We'll tell people you decided to keep it small and intimate, that way no one has to know about this. I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. Marcus was waiting for me in our small apartment above the flower shop we rented on Main Street. One look at my face told him everything he needed to know. He wrapped me in his arms, while I cried angry, heartbroken tears for the family I thought I had, and the unconditional love I'd believed was mine by birthright. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, something shifted inside me. The hurt was still there, raw and painful, but underneath it was something else, a burning determination that surprised me with its intensity. They wanted to be embarrassed by my wedding. They wanted to distance themselves from what Marcus and I were building together. Fine, but they weren't going to control the narrative. They weren't going to whisper their version of events around town, while I stayed quiet and ashamed. I was done being the Parker daughter who accepted whatever scraps of approval they threw my way. I was done letting them make me feel small for choosing love over luxury, authenticity over appearance. If they wanted to skip my wedding and tell people it was too embarrassing to attend, then the whole town was going to know exactly what kind of people they really were. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. The morning of my wedding dawned crisp and clear, the kind of perfect October day that made Millbrook look like a postcard. I woke up in my childhood bedroom for the last time, having stayed at Rachel's house the night before according to tradition, but as I looked around the room, where I'd grown up, with its faded wallpaper and photographs of high school friends, I felt none of the nostalgia I'd expected. Instead, I felt like I was saying goodbye to a version of myself that had spent too many years seeking approval that would never come. Rachel knocked softly, and entered with 2 cups of coffee and a smile that couldn't quite hide her concern. "How are you feeling?" she asked, settling on the bed beside me. "Like I'm about to marry the love of my life," I said, honestly, "and like I'm about to find out who my real family actually is." By 8 in the morning, my phone was already buzzing with messages from vendors and friends. Mrs. Henderson sent a photo of the bridal bouquet she'd finished at dawn, more beautiful than anything I could have imagined. Helen Martinez texted that she'd already arrived at the community center to capture the setup process, wanting to document every detail of the day my family had dismissed as embarrassing. What I wasn't prepared for was the text from Amanda that arrived while I was getting ready. "Jess, I know you're angry, but it's not too late to work things out. Mom and Dad are hurt, but they'd come if you asked them to. Don't let pride ruin your relationship with your family. I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling the familiar tug of guilt and obligation that had governed my decisions for most of my life. Even now, hours before my wedding, Amanda was positioning me as the problem, the one whose pride was causing family division, not my parents, who'd called my celebration embarrassing and refused to attend, not her, who'd supported their decision and added her own critiques. Me for refusing to beg for their presence at my own wedding. I showed the text to Rachel, who read it with growing indignation. She's got some nerve, Rachel said, shaking her head. Where was this concern for family relationships when they were trashing your wedding plans to half the town? Instead of responding to Amanda, I called Marcus. Good morning, my almost husband, I said, feeling my spirits lift at the sound of his voice. Good morning, my almost wife. How are you holding up? I got a guilt trip text from Amanda, but other than that I'm perfect. Are you ready to marry me in front of everyone except my family? I've been ready since the day I met you, and Jess, from what I've been hearing around town, we're going to have the most supportive audience imaginable. He was right. As I arrived at the community center that afternoon, I was stunned by what I found. The space had been transformed into something magical, far beyond anything I'd originally planned. Janet Morrison had enlisted help from half the town to hang white fabric and twinkling lights from every available surface. The simple folding chairs I'd rented were now decorated with small bouquets, courtesy of Mrs. Henderson's donation of extra flowers. The tables were set with linens borrowed from the church, creating an elegance that rivaled any fancy venue. But more surprising than the decorations was the crowd. People had started arriving early, not because they were required to, but because they wanted to show their support. I recognized faces from all corners of Millbrook, customers from the hardware store, clients from my event planning business, neighbors who'd watched me grow up, and even people I barely knew who'd apparently decided this was an event worth attending. Helen Martinez was everywhere, her camera capturing not just the beautiful setup, but the faces of people who'd come to celebrate with us. Mrs. Patterson from the post office was arranging programs on chairs. The mayor's wife was helping Sarah Kim set up the appetizer station. Even Father Rodriguez from St. Mary Luke, where I'd attended Mass as a child, had come to offer his blessing despite the ceremony being at the community center. This is incredible, I breathed to Rachel as I took in the scene from the bridal preparation room. This is what happens when people see genuine love being celebrated, she replied, adjusting my veil, and when they see a family treating their daughter shamefully for no good reason. As 5 o'clock approached, I could hear the murmur of conversation growing louder in the main hall. Janet Morrison knocked on the door to give me the final head count, 67 guests, almost double what we'd originally expected. Word had spread throughout Millbrook about the wedding the Parker family was too embarrassed to attend, and people had decided to come see for themselves what all the fuss was about. There's something else, Janet said with a smile. 3 local business owners asked if they could contribute to your gift table. They said any couple brave enough to stand up to family pressure deserved all the support they could get. When it was time for the processional, I took my place at the back of the hall and looked toward the altar where Marcus stood waiting. He looked more handsome than I'd ever seen him, his face glowing with joy and anticipation. Behind him stood his groomsmen, his brother who'd driven down from Cleveland, his best friend from high school, and Rachel's husband Tom, who'd become close with Marcus over the past 2 years. The music started, and Rachel began her walk down the aisle as my maid of honor. She'd stepped into the role Amanda should have filled, and she carried herself with a dignity and joy that Amanda had never shown about my wedding. As she reached the altar, she caught my eye and gave me an encouraging nod. Then it was my turn. I had chosen to walk alone, a decision that felt right given my family's absence. But as I took my first steps down the aisle, I realized I wasn't alone at all. Every face I passed was smiling, many with tears in their eyes. Mrs. Henderson dabbed at her face with a tissue. Sarah Kim beamed from her seat in the 3rd row. Even people I barely knew were looking at me with warmth and support. Halfway down the aisle, I noticed the empty section where my family should have been sitting. 4 chairs that would remain vacant throughout the ceremony, a visible reminder of the people who'd chosen their pride over my happiness. But instead of feeling sad or embarrassed, I felt a surge of strength. Their absence didn't diminish this moment, it clarified it. I was surrounded by people who'd chosen to be here, who wanted to celebrate this love Marcus and I had built together. Marcus was crying when I reached him, tears of joy streaming down his face. "You look absolutely perfect," he whispered as I took his hands. The ceremony itself was everything we dreamed it would be. Father Rodriguez had agreed to perform a non-denominational blessing, speaking about love that weathers storms and commitment that grows stronger under pressure. When we exchanged vows, Marcus promised to always see me as worthy of celebration, while I promised to never again make myself smaller to fit into someone else's vision of who I should be. The moment that will stay with me forever came during the ring exchange. As Marcus slipped the simple gold band onto my finger, someone in the audience started applauding. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted in cheers and applause, a spontaneous outpouring of joy that lasted nearly a minute. In all my years of planning other people's weddings, I'd never seen anything like it. "You may kiss your bride," Father Rodriguez said with a grin, and when Marcus and I kissed, the cheers started all over again. The reception was a revelation. Sarah Kim had outdone herself with the food, presenting dishes that had people asking for recipes in seconds. Mike Stevens kept the dance floor packed with a mix of music that had 3 generations dancing together. The cake, a simple 3-tier design from the local bakery, was photographed more than any elaborate creation I'd ever seen at fancier venues. But the moment that changed everything came during the toasts. Rachel had prepared a beautiful speech about friendship and love, and Marcus's brother had shared funny stories about their childhood. Then Mrs. Henderson stood up unexpectedly, asking if she could say a few words. "I've been part of this community for over 30 years, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "I've provided flowers for hundreds of celebrations, and I've seen every kind of family dynamic you can imagine, but I have never seen parents miss their child's wedding because they were embarrassed by choices that prioritized love over luxury." The hall went completely silent, everyone hanging on her words. Jessica and Marcus planned a celebration that honored the values, their community, and their budget. They chose local vendors not because they couldn't afford better, but because they wanted to support the people who've supported them. They chose this venue, not because they had to settle, but because this is where their community gathers for important moments. She paused, looking directly at the empty chairs where my family should have been sitting. The Parker family's absence tonight isn't Jessica's embarrassment, it's their loss. They've missed witnessing one of the most beautiful celebrations of love I've ever been privileged to be part of, and frankly, their daughter deserves better. The applause that followed was thunderous, but more importantly, it felt like a collective declaration of support. These people weren't just celebrating my marriage, they were validating the choices Marcus and I had made, and condemning the family that had abandoned us for making them. Helen Martinez captured every moment, creating a visual record of a community coming together to support love over pretension. She photographed the empty family section, but she also photographed the overflowing dance floor, the tears of joy on guests' faces, and the obvious happiness radiating from Marcus and me throughout the evening. As the night wound down, something unexpected happened. People began approaching me, not just to congratulate us, but to share their own stories. Mrs. Patterson told me about her own family's rejection when she'd married outside her faith 40 years ago. Tom Morrison shared how his parents had boycotted his wedding because they disapproved of his career choice. Story after story of people who'd faced family judgment for making authentic choices, and who'd found happiness by staying true to themselves rather than conforming to others' expectations. "You've given a lot of people permission to be proud of their own choices," Rachel observed as we watched the last guests filter out into the crisp October night. The following Monday, something remarkable happened. Helen Martinez had created a photo album of the wedding and brought it to display at her studio downtown. Word spread quickly, and by Wednesday, there was a steady stream of people stopping by to look at pictures of what the local gossips had dubbed the wedding the Parkers missed. But the real impact became clear when I returned to work the following week.
Oh!
My event planning business, which had been modest but steady, was suddenly inundated with calls from couples who wanted the kind of authentic celebration Jessica Parker had. They'd heard about a wedding where community mattered more than expense, where local vendors had created magic within a reasonable budget, and where love had triumphed over family politics. Within a month, I'd booked 6 new weddings for the following year, each from couples who specifically requested the same vendors who'd made my day special. Mrs. Henderson's flower orders doubled. Sarah Kim started getting catering requests from neighboring towns. Mike Stevens booked solid through the next summer. The transformation wasn't just professional. Marcus and I found ourselves at the center of a community we'd never realized existed, made up of people who valued authenticity over appearances, substance over showmanship. We were invited to dinner parties, included in community planning committees, and welcomed into social circles that had nothing to do with the Parker family name or hardware store legacy. Meanwhile, my family's situation continued to deteriorate. Without my unpaid labor and organizational skills, the hardware store struggled. My parents, who'd spent so much energy maintaining their social standing, found that standing significantly diminished after their public rejection of their daughter's wedding. Amanda's engagement to Tyler quietly dissolved 6 months later, apparently unable to withstand the scrutiny that came with being associated with the family that had abandoned their daughter over wedding venue choices. I didn't take pleasure in their struggles, but I didn't feel guilty about them either. These were the natural consequences of choices they'd made, prioritizing image over relationship and pride over love. They'd gambled that I would bend to their will rather than risk their disapproval, and they'd lost. The only contact I had with them came through a letter my mother sent 8 months after the wedding. It was brief and formal, acknowledging that they'd perhaps been too harsh in their judgment of my wedding plans. But even in her apology, she couldn't resist adding that they hoped I'd learned the value of considering family input in major life decisions. I never responded to the letter. By then, Marcus and I were settled into our new life, surrounded by people who celebrated our choices rather than criticizing them. We'd bought a small house on the outskirts of Millbrook with a garden where I could grow flowers for my own arrangements. My business had expanded beyond my wildest expectations, and Marcus's auto shop had become the go-to place for repairs throughout 3 counties. 1 year after our wedding, Helen Martinez approached us with an idea. She'd been documenting other couples who'd chosen authentic celebrations over elaborate performances, and she wanted to create an exhibit called Real Love Weddings That Matter. Our wedding photos would be featured alongside other couples who'd prioritized meaning over money, community over competition. The exhibit opened at the Millbrook Community Center, the same space where we'd been married. It drew visitors from surrounding towns, people curious about this movement toward authentic celebration. Local newspapers picked up the story, and suddenly our wedding became part of a larger conversation about family expectations, community support, and the courage required to live authentically. Standing in that same room, where we'd exchanged vows, surrounded by photographs of our celebration, and the faces of people who'd supported us, I felt a profound sense of completion. The girl who'd spent 29 years seeking approval from people who would never give it was gone. In her place stood a woman who'd learned that the most important approval comes from within, and that authentic love creates its own community of support. Marcus wrapped his arms around me from behind as we looked at the photographs covering the walls. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. I thought about the question seriously, considering everything we'd gained and lost over the past year. We'd lost my family's presence in our life, but we'd gained a community that truly valued us. We'd lost the illusion of unconditional family love, but we'd discovered the reality of chosen family support. We'd lost the comfort of familiar dysfunction, but we'd gained the strength that comes from authentic living. "Not a single one," I said, leaning back against his chest. "This is exactly where we're supposed to be."
The evening ended with an impromptu reception, as many of our original wedding guests had come to see the exhibit. Mrs. Henderson brought flowers, Sarah Kim provided appetizers, and Mike Stevens set up his sound system for dancing. It felt like a celebration of not just our marriage, but of a community that had learned to recognize and support authentic love. As we danced to the same song we'd chosen for our first dance a year ago, I caught sight of the empty chairs that still sat in one corner of the room, left over from some other event. But this time, they didn't represent absence or abandonment, they represented choice. The choice to surround ourselves with people who see our worth, who celebrate our decisions, and who understand that real love doesn't require anyone's permission to exist. My family had called my wedding embarrassing, and stayed home, believing their
absence would shame me into conforming to their expectations. Instead, their absence had freed me to discover who I really was and what I was truly capable of. They'd wanted to make sure the whole town knew they disapproved of my choices. Mission accomplished. The whole town knew exactly where the Parker family stood and exactly where I stood in response, and I'd never been happier to stand alone. 2 years after the wedding that my family refused to attend, I found myself standing in the conference room of Millbrook's newest event venue, presenting my business proposal to a panel of investors from Columbus. Parker Events had grown from a one-woman operation run out of my apartment to a full-service company with 3 employees and a waiting list that stretched 6 months into the future. The irony wasn't lost on me that my success had come precisely because I'd refused to compromise my values to meet my family's expectations. "Miss Williams," the lead investor said, using my married name as she reviewed the financial projections spread across the mahogany table, "your growth trajectory is impressive, but what makes you confident this expansion into Columbus will succeed when you've built your reputation in such a small market?" I smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. Because authentic celebration isn't limited by geography. What we've proven in Millbrook is that couples everywhere are hungry for weddings that reflect their values rather than their bank accounts. They want vendors who care about their story, not just their budget. The presentation went better than I dared hope. By the time I walked out of that building, I had secured funding to open Parker Events Columbus, a satellite office that would serve couples throughout Central Ohio while maintaining the community-focused approach that had made us successful in Millbrook. Marcus was waiting for me in the parking lot, leaning against his truck with a grin that told me he already knew the good news from my expression. "So, Mrs. Williams, are we celebrating tonight?" "We're celebrating," I confirmed, falling into his arms for a kiss that still made my heart race after 3 years together. "But first, I want to make a stop." 20 minutes later, we pulled up in front of Henderson's garden shop. Through the large front window, I could see Mrs. Henderson arranging a display of autumn mums and decorative gourds. She looked up as we entered, her face breaking into the warm smile that had made her shop a second home to me over the years. "Jessica dear, you look like you're bursting with news," she said, setting down her pruning shears. "The Columbus expansion is officially happening," I announced. "And I want you to be part of it." What followed was a conversation I'd been planning for months. Mrs. Henderson had mentioned several times that she was considering retirement, that the physical demands of the flower business were becoming challenging for someone in her 70s. But she'd also expressed sadness at the thought of closing a shop that had been her life's work for over 3 decades. My proposal was simple. She would become the senior floral consultant for Parker Events, splitting her time between the Millbrook shop and our new Columbus location. She'd have help with the physical aspects of the business while maintaining creative control over the designs that had made her reputation. It would allow her to continue doing what she loved while ensuring her expertise wouldn't be lost to retirement. "You'd really want an old woman like me as part of your fancy expansion?" she asked, though I could see the excitement in her eyes. "Mrs. Henderson, you're not just part of the expansion, you're the reason it's possible. Everything we've built started with vendors like you who believe in celebrating love authentically. I wouldn't dream of growing without the people who made this success possible." That evening, Marcus and I drove to our favorite spot overlooking Millbrook, a small hill on the outskirts of town where we'd had our first real conversation about our future together. The lights of the town spread out below us, including the soft glow from the community center where we'd been married. "Are you sure you're ready for all this change?" Marcus asked as we sat on the tailgate of his truck, sharing a thermos of coffee and watching the sunset. It was a fair question. The expansion would mean travel, new responsibilities, and a level of business complexity I'd never managed before. But it also represented something I'd never imagined possible when I was the overlooked daughter, trying desperately to earn my family's approval. "I keep thinking about something Mrs. Patterson said at the post office last week," I told him. "She mentioned that her granddaughter is getting married next spring, and she specifically requested the Jessica Parker experience for her wedding planning. A 23-year-old girl who's never met me wants to plan her wedding the way I planned mine because she heard it was real and beautiful and authentic." Marcus nodded, understanding immediately. "You're not just planning weddings anymore, you're changing how people think about celebration." "Exactly, and if we can do that in Millbrook, we can do it anywhere." The next few months passed in a whirlwind of preparation. I hired 2 additional staff members, including Sandra Chen, a recent business school graduate who'd written her thesis on community-based marketing strategies. I also brought on David Rodriguez, a photographer who'd worked with Helen Martinez on several projects and shared her commitment to telling authentic stories through images. The most challenging part of the expansion wasn't the logistics or the finances. It was the reaction from my family, who apparently felt that my success was somehow a reflection on their judgment. Amanda, who'd struggled to rebuild her social standing after her engagement collapsed, made several pointed comments about people who leveraged family drama for business gain. The comments reached me through the small-town gossip network, usually delivered by well-meaning friends who thought I should know what was being said. Rachel, who'd become my closest confidant and business advisor, was less diplomatic in her assessment. "They're jealous," she said bluntly during one of our regular coffee meetings at Corner Cafe. "You've built something amazing despite their lack of support, and they can't stand that their rejection didn't destroy you the way they expected it would." The truth of her words became apparent when my mother showed up at my office unexpectedly one Tuesday afternoon in March. I hadn't seen her since the confrontation before my wedding, though I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd aged considerably over the past 2 years. The woman who walked into Parker Events looked smaller somehow, less commanding than the person who'd once dismissed my dreams with such certainty. "Jessica, I think it's time we talked," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk without invitation. I studied her face, looking for signs of genuine remorse or continued manipulation. What I saw was something I'd never expected: uncertainty. For the first time in my memory, Patricia Parker looked unsure of herself. "What would you like to talk about, Mom?" "Your father and I have been watching your success from a distance," she began carefully. "The business, the recognition you've received, the way people speak about you in town. We're proud of what you've accomplished." The words I'd longed to hear for most of my life hung in the air between us, but they felt strangely hollow. After years of seeking that exact validation, I discovered that receiving it felt more anticlimactic than satisfying. "But?" I prompted, sensing there was more to this conversation. "But we still think you could have handled the wedding situation differently. If you'd been willing to compromise, to consider our perspective, none of this unpleasantness would have been necessary." There it was. Even in what was supposed to be an acknowledgement of my success, she couldn't resist rewriting history to make my choices the problem, rather than their reaction to those choices. I felt a familiar knot form in my stomach, the same feeling I'd carried for years whenever family conversations turned to my inadequacies. But then something interesting happened. Instead of feeling guilty or defensive, I felt a curious detachment. Her words, which once would have sent me spiraling into self-doubt, now sounded like lines from a play I'd outgrown. "Mom, I want you to understand something," I said, keeping my voice calm and professional. "I didn't handle the wedding situation differently, because there was nothing wrong with how I handled it. Marcus and I planned a celebration that reflected our values and our budget. We chose vendors we trusted and respected. We invited people we loved. The only thing wrong with that wedding was your decision not to attend it." Her face flushed, the old anger flashing in her eyes. "You're still blaming us for having standards, for wanting better for our daughter." "I'm not blaming you for anything," I replied. I'm simply stating facts. You called my wedding embarrassing. You refused to attend. You told people around town that you'd rather not be associated with our choices. Those were your decisions, and they had consequences. And what consequences are those? I gestured around my office, with its awards on the walls, client testimonials framed near the window, and calendar booked solid for the next 8 months. You missed the opportunity to support your daughter's happiness. You lost the chance to be part of building something meaningful. And most importantly, you demonstrated to an entire community that your pride matters more to you than your children's joy. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but it followed predictable patterns. My mother alternated between attempts to guilt me into accepting responsibility for the family rift and grudging acknowledgments of my business success. She never once offered a genuine apology for calling my wedding embarrassing or refusing to attend. She never acknowledged that their behavior had been hurtful or wrong. When she finally left, I felt an unexpected sense of closure. For years I'd imagined that a conversation like this might heal our relationship, that the right words or gesture might bridge the gap between us. Instead, I'd learned that some gaps exist not because of misunderstanding, but because of fundamental differences in values and priorities. That evening, I called Helen Martinez to share the news about the Columbus expansion and to ask if she'd consider documenting the launch event we were planning for the new office. Of course I'll photograph it, she said immediately. But Jessica, I want to tell you something else. Remember that photo series I did about your wedding? It's been selected for inclusion in a traveling exhibit about community and authenticity in modern celebration. Your story is going to be seen by people across the Midwest. The exhibit, titled Choosing Love: Stories of Authentic Celebration, would open at The Ohio State University Cultural Arts Center in Columbus, just blocks from where our new office would be located. The timing felt like more than coincidence. It felt like validation of everything we'd built and confirmation that we were moving in the right direction. The launch event for Parker Events Columbus took place on a warm Saturday in May, exactly 3 years after my original wedding date. We'd rented space in a beautifully restored warehouse in the Short North District, with exposed brick walls and industrial lighting that created the perfect backdrop for showcasing our aesthetic. The guest list included potential clients, vendor partners, and media representatives, but also friends and supporters who'd made the trip from Millbrook to celebrate this milestone. Mrs. Henderson had created stunning floral arrangements using locally sourced blooms. Sarah Kim had prepared an elegant selection of appetizers that showcased her signature comfort food elevated to cocktail party sophistication. Mike Stevens provided background music that perfectly captured the energy of new beginnings. But the moment that meant the most to me came when Rachel stood up to offer a toast. 3 years ago, Jessica Williams made a choice that changed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone who witnessed her courage. She chose authenticity over approval, community over conformity, and love over fear. Tonight we're celebrating not just a business expansion, but the ripple effects of one woman's decision to stand up for what she believed in. As applause filled the warehouse space, I caught sight of Helen Martinez positioning herself to capture the moment. In her viewfinder, I knew she was seeing more than just a successful business owner at a launch party. She was documenting the continuation of a story that had started with a young woman walking down an aisle alone, surrounded by people who'd chosen to celebrate her choices rather than criticize them. The evening was a complete success by any measure. We signed 3 new clients before the party ended, established partnerships with 6 Columbus area vendors, and generated enough media interest to book interviews with 2 local lifestyle magazines. But beyond the business metrics, something else had happened that night. We'd created a community of people who believed in celebrating love authentically, who valued substance over spectacle, and who understood that the most beautiful celebrations come from staying true to your values. As Marcus and I drove back to Millbrook that night, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this point. It had started with heartbreak and rejection, with family members who'd valued their image more than my happiness. But it had led to something I'd never imagined possible, a business built on authenticity, a marriage strengthened by adversity, and a community of people who'd rallied around values rather than appearances. Do you think your parents will ever understand what they missed? Marcus asked as we passed the sign welcoming us back to Millbrook. I considered his question carefully. My mother's visit had made it clear that they were aware of my success, but awareness and understanding were different things. They might eventually acknowledge that I'd built something valuable, but they'd probably never accept that I'd done it by rejecting their vision of who I should be. I don't think they'll ever understand, I said finally, but I'm okay with that now. I spent so many years trying to earn their approval that I forgot to ask whether their approval was worth earning. Building this business, creating this life with you, finding our community, and none of that required their permission or their understanding. 6 months later, Parker Events was featured on the cover of Ohio Bride magazine, with a 6-page spread titled The Wedding Planner Who's Changing How We Celebrate. The article included photos from my own wedding, showcasing the beauty that could be created when couples prioritized meaning over money, community over competition. The magazine hit newsstands on a Tuesday. By Thursday, our phone lines were overwhelmed with inquiries from couples across the state who wanted the Parker Events experience. By the following Monday, we'd booked enough new clients to justify hiring 2 additional staff members and seriously considering a second expansion into Cleveland. The success was gratifying, but it also felt surreal. 3 years earlier, I'd been planning my own wedding while fighting for basic respect from my family. Now couples were seeking me out specifically because they'd heard about that same wedding, because they wanted to create celebrations that prioritized authenticity over appearances. The full circle moment came when Amanda called me for the first time since before my wedding. She'd gotten engaged again, this time to a pediatrician she'd met during her residency, and she wanted to hire Parker Events to plan their celebration. "I know things have been difficult between us," she said when I answered the phone, her voice carefully neutral, "but I've been watching what you've built, and I have to admit it's impressive. David and I want something authentic for our wedding, something that reflects who we really are instead of who people expect us to be." The request was loaded with irony. Amanda, who'd supported our parents' decision to boycott my wedding because it wasn't fancy enough, now wanted to hire me to plan her own authentic celebration. Part of me wanted to refuse, to point out the hypocrisy of seeking my services after years of dismissing my choices. But as I listened to her describe her vision for the wedding, I heard something I'd never heard from Amanda before: uncertainty about our parents' expectations, worry about living up to external standards, and a genuine desire to create something meaningful rather than impressive. "Amanda, I'll consider taking you on as a client, but I need you to understand something first," I said. "Parker Events creates celebrations that reflect our clients' values, not their families' expectations. If you hire us, you're committing to making choices based on what you and David want, not what Mom and Dad think you should want." "I understand," she said quietly, "and Jessica, I owe you an apology. I should have supported you when you were planning your wedding. I should have stood up to Mom and Dad when they were being unreasonable. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." The apology was 3 years late, but it was also genuine in a way that our mother's grudging acknowledgement had never been. Amanda had learned through her own experience what I'd tried to tell them years earlier, that planning a wedding while fighting family expectations was exhausting and heartbreaking. I agreed to meet with Amanda and her fiancé, and we ended up planning a beautiful celebration that struck the perfect balance between elegant and authentic. The wedding took place at a restored barn outside Millbrook, with locally sourced food, flowers from Mrs. Henderson, and music that reflected the couple's actual tastes, rather than what they thought would impress guests. Our parents attended Amanda's wedding, of course. They couldn't very well boycott 2 daughters' celebrations without facing more social consequences than their pride could bear. But watching them that day, I realized that their presence at Amanda's wedding didn't diminish the significance of their absence from mine. If anything, it highlighted the difference between conditional support and unconditional love. After the ceremony, my father approached me while I was coordinating the reception timeline with the catering staff. We hadn't spoken directly since the night before my own wedding, and I wasn't sure what to expect from this conversation. "You did a beautiful job with this," he said, gesturing toward the reception space, where guests were mingling and laughing. "Amanda looks happy." "She is happy," I agreed. "She and David chose everything themselves, without worrying about meeting anyone else's expectations." He was quiet for a moment, watching couples dance to music that actually meant something to the bride and groom. "I suppose we could have been more supportive when you were planning your celebration.
It wasn't quite an apology, but it was closer to accountability than anything I'd received from either parent in the past 3 years. Dad, the difference between Amanda's wedding and mine isn't the planning or the vendors or the venues. The difference is that you're here celebrating with her instead of criticizing her choices from a distance. Maybe we made some mistakes, he admitted. Maybe you did, I agreed, but I'm not angry about it anymore. Those mistakes led me to build something I'm proud of, to find people who support my choices, and to learn that I don't need anyone's permission to live authentically. As the evening wound down and guests began filtering out into the warm September night, I found myself standing where I'd stood so many times as a wedding planner, surveying a successful celebration, and feeling satisfied with a job well done. But this time felt different, not just because it was my sister's wedding, but because it represented a kind of closure. Amanda approached me as I was packing up my coordination materials, looking more relaxed and happy than I'd seen her in years. Thank you, she said simply, not just for planning this, but for showing me what it looks like to stand up for what you believe in. You're welcome, I replied, and Amanda, I'm glad you found someone who loves you for who you are, not who you think you should be. Marcus was waiting for me in the parking lot, leaning against our car with the patient smile of someone who'd watched me work dozens of weddings over the past 3 years. How does it feel to plan a wedding your parents actually attended? He asked, as I collapsed into the passenger seat. I thought about his question as we drove through the quiet streets of Millbrook toward our house. It feels like the end of a chapter, I said finally. The chapter where I was still hoping they'd realize they were wrong about our wedding, still wanting them to apologize for calling it embarrassing. And now I realize that their opinion of our wedding never mattered as much as I thought it did. What mattered was that we created something beautiful and authentic, and that we surrounded ourselves with people who celebrated that choice. Everything else was just noise. 5 years after the wedding my family called embarrassing, Parker Events had become one of the most sought-after planning companies in Central Ohio. We'd expanded to 3 locations, employed 12 people, and had a waiting list that stretched nearly a year into the future. More importantly, we'd helped hundreds of couples create celebrations that reflected their values, rather than their bank accounts, or their family's expectations. The business success was gratifying, but it wasn't the most important thing that had grown out of that difficult time. Marcus and I had built a marriage based on mutual support and shared values. We'd created a chosen family of friends and colleagues who celebrated our achievements and supported us through challenges. We'd learned that authentic love doesn't require anyone's permission to exist, and that the most beautiful celebrations come from staying true to yourself. On our 5th wedding anniversary, Marcus surprised me with a renewal ceremony at the same community center where we'd been married. Mrs. Henderson, now in her 70s but still creating stunning floral arrangements, provided flowers that far exceeded anything we could have afforded as newlyweds. Sarah Kim prepared a feast that had our guests talking for months afterward. Helen Martinez captured every moment, adding new chapters to the visual story she'd been telling about our journey. But the most meaningful part of the celebration was the guest list. The people who'd attended our original wedding were there, of course, but they'd been joined by dozens of couples whose own celebrations we'd planned over the years. Clients who'd become friends, vendors who'd become partners, and community members who'd rallied around our story of choosing authenticity over approval. My family attended the renewal ceremony, not because they'd suddenly understood the value of what we'd built, but because their absence would have been more socially costly than their presence. They were polite and appropriate, but there was a distance between us that had become comfortable rather than painful. During the reception, a young bride who'd hired us for her upcoming wedding approached me with tears in her eyes. Mrs. Williams, I just wanted to thank you for showing me that it's okay to plan the wedding I actually want instead of the wedding everyone expects me to want. Looking around the room at the faces of people who'd chosen to celebrate with us, I realized that my family's rejection had led to something far more valuable than their approval ever could have been. It had led to freedom, the freedom to build a life based on my own values, to create a business that reflected my authentic self, and to surround myself with people who saw my worth rather than my deficits. The girl who'd once walked down an aisle alone, abandoned by family who found her choices embarrassing, had become a woman surrounded by chosen family who found her choices inspiring. The wedding they'd dismissed as inadequate had become the foundation for a business built on celebrating love authentically. The daughter they'd never quite seen as worthy had learned to see herself as valuable, not despite their rejection, but because of what she'd built in response to it. As Marcus and I danced to the same song we'd chosen 5 years earlier, surrounded by people who'd watched us weather storms and build something beautiful together, I realized that sometimes the greatest gift your family can give you is the courage to outgrow their limitations. Sometimes the most loving thing they can do is show you so clearly what conditional love looks like that you become determined to create something unconditional for yourself. My family had called my wedding embarrassing and made sure the whole town knew they disapproved. They'd succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. The whole town knew exactly where they stood, and exactly where I stood in response. And 5 years later, there was no question which position had proven to be on the right side of history. 10 years had passed since the wedding that changed everything, and I stood in the grand ballroom of the Millbrook Convention Center, watching my daughter Emma play with the children of couples whose weddings I'd planned over the past decade. At 8 years old, she had Marcus's gentle nature and my determination, along with an infectious laugh that drew people to her like a magnet. The occasion was the 10th anniversary celebration of Parker Events, but it felt more like a reunion of chosen family. Hundreds of people had come to celebrate not just a business milestone, but a movement that had grown far beyond anything I'd imagined possible. Couples traveled from across the Midwest to share stories of how our approach to authentic celebration had influenced their own marriages and life choices. Mrs. Henderson, now 82 and officially retired but still consulted on special projects, sat at the head table with tears streaming down her face as speakers shared testimonials about the impact our work had made on their lives. Sarah Kim had become a celebrity chef with her own cookbook, but she'd insisted on catering this event personally as her gift to us. Helen Martinez had documented our journey for a decade, creating a visual archive that would soon become a traveling exhibition at wedding venues across the country. But the moment that crystallized everything for me came when Amanda approached the microphone during the open testimonial portion of the evening. She'd become a successful pediatrician and devoted mother of twins, but more importantly, she'd learned to make choices based on her own values rather than external expectations. My sister taught me that love doesn't require anyone's permission to be celebrated, Amanda said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed ballroom. She showed me that family isn't just about blood relationships, but about people who choose to support your happiness even when it's inconvenient for them. Most importantly, she proved that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept love that comes with impossible conditions. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes, but it wasn't just applause for a speech, it was recognition of a truth that had rippled outward from one young woman's decision to walk down an aisle alone, rather than compromise her authentic vision of love. As the evening concluded and guests began filtering out into the warm June night, I found myself surrounded by 3 generations of people whose lives had been touched by our story. Young couples planning their first celebrations, middle-aged pairs renewing their vows, and older couples who'd found the courage to recommit to authenticity after decades of living for others' approval. Marcus appeared at my side, Emma sleeping peacefully in his arms after an evening of dancing and celebration. Ready to go home? He asked softly. I looked around the ballroom one more time, taking in the faces of people who'd become our true family, the success built on staying true to our values, and the legacy we'd created simply by refusing to accept that love should be embarrassing to anyone. More than ready, I said. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.